Hello, my name is Dejan Boshkov, Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Today we continue our series on the Berlin defense, and today we are going to show some of the good things about the Berlin. And the main thing, the best thing for the second player, this is the bishop pair that he gets immediately out of the opening. The first game that we're going to discuss is Shirov as white against Naidic. They played in Villarrobledo in Spain. That's a rapid tournament, 2009. So first we just go to quickly the starting moves. Bishop takes c6, takes knight to f5, queens exchanged, black has his pair of bishops, white has his better pawn structure. Knight c3, king e8, so far there is nothing unusual. h3, h5, black is playing for blockade. Sometimes he just advances that pawn on h4, trying to stop the pawn majority from white on that side of the board. Knight e2, bishop e7. So far everything was played many times before, and here usually white was almost all the time playing bishop g5, trying to exchange the bishop pair, and eventually after that to make use of his pluses, mainly the extra space and the better pawn structure on the king's flank. But in that game, Shirov decided to try a new way, and he jumped knight e to d4, exchanging the knights rather than the bishops. After knight takes d4, we have a very typical position, which is a dream position for black. Usually he doesn't achieve such a nice position from the beginning, where he has pure two bishops against a bishop of the opponent, and eventually this pawn on e5 in some lines might be even a weakness somewhere in the future. So what is so great about these two bishops? It seems like there shouldn't be a problem for white. He has an active knight on d4, eventually he wants to push f4 and f5, but with the next move that Naidic plays, he will show that there are also some good things about those bishops. First of all, he plays c5, he repels that knight away from the center and frees the f5 square for the bishop. After knight b5, there comes the subtle king d7 move, very typical for the Berlin. The king is heading for the c6 square, a square that is available for him thanks to the fact that there is no light square bishop in white's camp, and from c6 that king is not only going to protect the pawn on c7, but it will also help the black pawns to be advanced on the queen's flank, and eventually this will help black also to create a very dangerous passed pawn there that will be most probably defended by the two bishops. c4 was played. White needs to somehow try to create outposts for the knight, and that outpost at the moment is the d5 square. King c6, knight c3, bishop to e6. Of course, black is not going to allow that knight to come on d5. He is just developing a piece with the tempo, attacking the pawn on c4, forcing b3, and with his next move he is also occupying the open file. He could have done that with the other rook, but in fact he wants to use this one on the queen's flank, because the standard plan for black in these situations is to advance the pawns on the queen's flank, where he is stronger. Either it will be a5 and a4, or a6 and b5, trying to undermine one of the pawns or exchange the b pawns and to create a weakness on b4. And the other plan, like I said, is a5, a4, exchanging on b3, and eventually getting in with his pieces. Shirov played knight to e2. The alternatives are bishop to e3, then black will play a5 like we said. The point is that white cannot really keep the position shut and blocked by playing the move a4, as then rook d3 is coming with the tempo. The knight is hanging, the pawn on b3 is very vulnerable. After rook ac1, rook a d8, black has firm control over the open file and many possibilities to strengthen the position. For example, he can calmly proceed with b6, king b7, c6, preparing b5. Once that he prepares b5, that pawn on b3 will become a weakness, and almost inevitably black is going to win that pawn. On the other hand, we cannot see a real plan for white. He cannot really advance the pawns on the king's flank. The bishop doesn't really have some good squares. And also in case of a need, or if he likes, black can play f6, opening that diagonal for the bishop as well, and furthermore strengthening the pressure along the queen's flank. So black is obviously better here. Besides bishop e3, he can also try to advance the pawns on the king's flank. That's very logical. He's much better here. He should be better on the king's flank. But after g6, again, it's very hard to see how is he going to proceed, as the light squares are firmly occupied by the black pieces, especially the bishop that doesn't really have a counterpart on e6. It's very strong. How can the game proceed? Knight e4, for example. The knight is heading for f6. It seems very beautiful square for the knight, but there is nothing to be attacked there for the time being. After rook d4, black is again better. Either knight f2, a5 followed by a4 will be played, or if he jumps knight f6, like we said, there are no objects for the attack, so black is just going to double the rooks. And finally, if he defends the knight, then bishop h4 is very annoying for the first player. For instance, g3, bishop f5, takes on h4. Now the advantage that black had transformed from a bishop pair to a better bishop. Just compare these bishops. The bishop from c1 is attacking his own pawn on f4, and the pawns on the king's flank are ruined. On the next move, black is just going to occupy the open file, and he will have great advantage. There is also an additional plan to transfer the king to f5 on the weakened light squares. Back to the game. Shirov decided to transfer the knight to a better position, and he played knight to e2. At the same time, okay, he is defending the d4 square, and he wants to jump on f4, eventually to exchange that knight for the bishop on e6. a5. In case of g5, there would have been f4 with some counterplay for the first player, especially if those pawns are exchanged. He will take back with the knight, swap the knight for the bishop, and then the rook will be working along the f-file. That's why Knight avoids to play on the side where he is weaker. Knight f4, and black played a4. The very typical way, like we said, to create counterplay on the queen's flank, concretely threatening to take a whole pawn on b3. Now he would like to force white to some recessions. If he takes the pawn, then all these pawns will be very weak. After rook takes a4, or even first bishop takes c4, black will have great advantage. And in the game, Shirov decided to play bishop e3, which is inaccurate in my view. I believe that he needed just to take that bishop and to get rid of the bishop pair. In that case, he is still worse. For example, after bishop e3, black can play g6. That will be very similar like in the game, or this could have happened on the next move. So, or black can also play b5. And after the exchange, he just wants to take on b3 to swap a pair of rooks eventually, whenever he wants to. And then after king b4 to attack the pawn on b3, and even to win it. Then there will be rook d3 coming, and rook takes b3. And note that there is no one to defend that pawn on b3. The same goes if white takes on a4 himself. After rook takes a4, next c4 coming, the rooks might be double along the a file. And note that once that black plays king c6, these d7 and b7 entry points for the white rooks are already shut, which means that black can proceed with his play against the a2 pawn. But in any case, white needed to play something like that, hoping that black will go for moves like rook d3, and then eventually to try to swap those rooks and somehow defend this position, eventually coming with the king to e2 and trying to swap the other rook as well. In that case, he will be out of danger, but like we saw, he has more problems to face. However, like he did in the game, he just left that bishop still on the board, and this was a huge mistake. G6 now was the last time that he could have taken the bishop, but instead he played rook f to d1. Let's see what will happen if he takes the bishop. Takes back, rook f d1, a takes b3, a takes b3, and now, for example, black can play a move like rook a3. Black rooks are much more active than their counterparts. Black is threatening to take on d1 and then to take the pawn on b3, which means that his opponent is forced to take on a3. Now the king is kicked off away from the center, and after king h2 there is rook d3 coming. Black is preparing b5 followed by c4, trying to use the awkward position of the rook on a3. And on the other hand, it's very difficult for black to counter-attack something on the king's flank. And even if he comes to attack those pawns on the king's flank, it should be black who is faster in the pawn race. So still, white is in trouble. However, what he did in the game was even worse. He played after g6, rook f to d1 immediately. Now after rook takes d1, bishop f5, that bishop remain on the board. Black is simply threatening to swap the pawns, and then bishop c2 will win first the b3 pawn and later the c4 pawn. There will be no one to defend them. In the game, I should have played knight d5, bishop f8, and now bishop to f4 would have lost, like I told you already. He is losing the pawn. Bishop to c2, rook e1, bishop takes b3, and let's say e6, the only way to somehow try to create counterplay on the king's flank, but this is too slow. F takes e6, rook takes e6, king d7 takes on g6, just bishop takes to c4. Black is having already an extra pawn. His pawns are moving very fast, and they have the support of the two bishops and also the rook, so he's just winning. Should have chose instead not to give the pawn naturally, and he played after bishop f8. He played rook d2, defending the c2 square. A takes b3, a takes b3, rook a3. Anyways, it's impossible to defend everything. So there is this weakness on b3. Anytime that the bishop comes somewhere near on this diagonal, that pawn is lost, and also the other one. And also he has a weak pawn on e5. So rook b2. And a very instructive moment here for black. He just goes back with the bishop to e6, threatening to take that knight and also threatening to play b5 and to discover the b3 pawn, after which both the rooks and the bishop will be attacking it and winning that pawn. Knight f4 or either knight f6, after which b5 takes and the pawn is going west and black is just winning with his extra pawn. So knight f4 was played, but like we said, there is an additional problem. This is the pawn on e5. It will be under attack now. Bishop g7. In case of knight takes e6 now, there is this intermediate check and this trick. There is a very unpleasant fork. White is losing, so he doesn't have a time already to take the bishop on e6. In the game he played rook b1, but after bishop f5 he first lost the pawn on e5, sorry, the pawn on b3, and later on the other pawn was left without defense. Knight d5, rook b1. This is the simplest. He's just swapping the rooks and soon after winning some extra material. So the game concluded like that. Knight e3, king d7, the king is going to e6 to take that pawn on e5. g4 takes, king e6, knight d5, bishop takes c4. Now the knight will be in a terrible situation here on a8. It is basically trapped because the king is defending these squares. f3, b5, and king b7 is coming. Should have just played king f2 and resigned. So the moral of this game mainly is that if black is left alone with the two bishops, they're usually much more important than the weakened pawn structure on the queen's flank, as it can eventually move forward and pawns can be swapped. Then on the queen's flank and the bishops really a great force, especially the light squared bishop. The bishop pair is also very good asset in the exchange Ruy Lopez, and in that case usually the white pawn stays on e4, which makes it easier for black to undermine this pawn, to exchange it when playing f5, and eventually to open the bishops even further on. And this is one game that we're going to see now. The game is Rolf Sand, not a very famous player, against Anar Alakhverdiev, international master. They played in Porto Caras in Greece 2005. So that's the usual position for the Ruy Lopez exchange. After knight takes d4, c5, knight e2, we have a very popular line even nowadays. Queens swapped, bishop goes to d7, knight c3. So far everything is normal, both of the sides are developing their pieces. Bishop comes to e3, b6, rook d2. Black doesn't want to exchange the rooks. He wants to fight against the e4 square, and eventually that rook can be assaulted along the e file to attack the bishop on e3. Rook d1, bishop c6. That bishop will make the difference in the game. f3, knight e7, completing the development. After knight f4, knight g6, knight h5, knight e5. Knight is already threatening to jump on c4, so white is more or less forced to play b3. Black opted for the move f5 in this position, which is not very commonly seen move, but it's a very logical one, as black is simply trying to give more space for the bishop. Now the tactical point is that if white takes on f5, there is knight takes f3 and rook takes to e3, and black is just totally winning this position. He has the bishop pair, he's attacking the knight on c3, he's attacking the pawn on f3, and the only thing that black has in this position is one check on d8. After king b7, that will be over for him. There are no threats. So he cannot take on f5. On the other hand, black wants to take on f5 in many cases and to use the g4 square. From theoretical point of view, knight g3 is the best move here, after which there are many plans for black to equalize the game. He can take on e4, for example, and play king b7, after which he would like either to play c4 to make the pawns look better, or he can also prepare e5 and a4, which is also a very typical position for the second player. In any case, he's very happy that he managed to swap those two pawns, as his bishop is really breathing, and he's also having this open file. And in the game, white didn't appreciate really the danger. He jumped on d5 with his knight, probably hoping that the centralized position of the pieces will be enough for him for a good game. After f takes e4 though, there are some things that started to happen here. Knight g4, first of all, black is attacking. He is concretely threatening to win a piece after bishop d5, and knight takes e3. And after bishop f4, black also opened the other bishop. The good thing about the bishops is that they can easily transfer from one side to another. And in that case, after c4, we suddenly realize that the bishop is already in the game. The bishop wants to go to c5 with very nasty check, and after that rook is coming on f5. This line pieces are getting very quickly into the game. Of course, white cannot take on c7 as he's losing the piece. Also bad is to take with the knight, because in that case after bishop c5 check, king h1 will be answered knight f2 always, or first c3, and after king f1 it's quite the same, c3, forcing the rook to go to e2, and after that there are many winning continuations. One is simply rook f8 with the threat to take on f4, another threat is to play g5, that knight on c7 is hanging. If it moves, knight e3 is a threat, knight takes f2 is a threat. There are so many threats, and also in addition, if that knight moves somewhere, let's say that it takes on a6, there is even bishop b5 coming, using the other diagonal for the bishop, okay, besides the other winning continuations. So if he cannot really take on c7, what else can he do? He can try to kick away the knight, and probably this is the best defense, but after bishop c5 check, king f1, c takes b3, black is opening the second diagonal for the bishop, and things are getting really very bad for the first player. A takes b3, g5, and black has increased his advantage. All the black pieces are in the game, the white king is under attack, the pawn on e4 is hanging. Here is a sample line. Bishop takes g5, knight h2 check, and rook takes e4. And in case of king d3 there is simply bishop takes d5, or in case of knight e3 there is simply doubling of the rooks. Oh, the rook e5 seems as well very good for the second player. The game saw instead on the 21st move b4. White was just trying to keep everything under control. However, the bishops are too powerful, and another good thing of the bishops is that they can be swapped for the knights almost any time, and this was one of the moments that this could have happened in the game. Black could have taken that knight, and after, let's say, rook takes d5, bishop takes b4, he's winning a pawn. Also, bishop got his usual place on c5 after that, and black is winning. For example, rook d7, bishop c5 check, one more check, forcing him to trade the bishop and to release the pressure against the c7 pawn. And next, rook f8 is coming with decisive advantage for black. What he chose in the game was also very good. He decided to keep the two bishops on the board, at least for the time being. He played g6 instead, which is great as well. Knight f6, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop takes b4. And there were some mass trades. Knight d6, that was the best plan for white, just to go into this opposite colored bishop endgame and to pick up the d6 pawn, but still not sufficient enough to save the game. After rook takes d6, king b7, this is another very good version of the endgame for the second player, with opposite colored bishops and weaknesses for the first player. This is one weakness, there is another one. And if we take into consideration the fact that black has an extra pawn, his win is normal here. So rook d7 was played, king c6, rook d6, king c5, the king got active, rook e6, he just took the pawn, bishop e3 check, king d5, white took back the pawn, but after bishop to d3, the coordination between the black pieces was soon established, and white resigned after bishop f4. There we have very typical exchange sacrifice, g takes f4, c3, the pawn cannot be stopped. There will be also a bridge, a kind of a bridge after bishop c4 if the rook steps behind the pawn, so white resigned.